Hi everyone, I'm Priya, and in this video series, I'm going to talk to you about the planet Mercury. Mercury is a planet that is the closest to the Sun, but don't let its tiny size fool the mighty impact that it has on shaping our personalities and how it impacts us in our lives. In this video series, I'm going to provide an explanation of Mercury, its role in astrology, and on your personality, depending on where it falls in your birth chart, as well as what to expect during a retrograde as well. Now, if you're fairly new to astrology or you don't have a great deal of knowledge about Mercury, I recommend you watch all of the sections in order, and in future, you may want to jump to particular chapters as needed. In this first section, I'm going to cover the role of the planet Mercury in astrology. Let's start with how it's got its name. Now, Mercury is the name of the Roman messenger god who was known to have wings on its helmet and shoes, as you can see in the picture here. This is because, just like the planet Mercury, he could move very quickly. The planet takes just 88 days to orbit the sun, so he could move at speed. In Indian astrology, Mercury is known as Buddha, who's the god of intellect and enlightenment or awareness, while in Greek mythology, the messenger god was called Hermes, which is most likely why the old courier company chose that name, as it represents moving things at speed from place to place, just like the winged god. Now, these ancient links give good clues about what Mercury represents in our birth chart and its role in our everyday life, because Mercury will impact things like language, communication, translation, and interpretation. It can impact ideas, knowledge, intellect, or memories, schedules, meetings, or appointments, travel, transportation, or logistics, community, the local neighborhood, and being out and about, machinery, or things that have moving parts and sensors, such as vehicles or appliances, technology, including the internet or electronic devices, and parts of the body, such as brain and speech. Now, many of the things that I've described are very similar to the descriptions of the third and the sixth houses, which I described in a different video. And this makes complete sense because both of these houses are the ones that are ruled by Mercury. Mercury is a ruling planet of the signs of Gemini and Virgo. And this kind of means that Mercury is at home in these signs, and both of them together represent the yin and the yang of the traits. Like Gemini is like the blue sky thinking, big picture ideas part of the planet, whereas Virgo is like the small print, the devil in the detail element. So both signs are considered messengers on Earth. So if you have either of these signs in your top three, such as your sun, moon, or rising, as well as in your Mercury as well, you are considered an excellent communicator and someone who has a purpose or gift with your way of words and your intellect through spreading or inspiring ideas. Now, that's not to say that other signs don't have these abilities, but these are unique characteristics to this particular signs, and that is down to the influence of their ruling planet. In this next section, I will talk about how the sign that Mercury falls in your birth chart can give clues to the way that you communicate and the way that you think and your intellect, if you want the most literal meaning of its influence on your personality. Now, my Mercury sign is in Virgo, which makes complete sense as I can be extremely detailed in my communication style. And you may notice that I like to give lots of practical examples in my videos. Virgos tend to be very solution focused. So there's no doubt that anyone who knows me, when they come with a problem, means that there's no point in coming to me if you're not prepared for lots of advice on what to do. And in fact, I've actually been known to give people like to-do lists, deadlines, even homework, where I'm like, right, this is what you need to do. And by Thursday, like, you just go on this website and put this. And so, yeah, even if you haven't asked for advice, it's usually going to be there. So I'll blame that on my Mercury and Virgo, okay? The other part of Virgo can be a very perfectionist kind of side. So I'll lose the plot if I've made a typo in something, and I'll be constantly like revisiting things and watching things back and being like, why did I say this? And oh, I should have written this in my email. So yeah, that can be very synonymous with my communication style because of the Virgo element of that. And one of my youngest memories actually I have of my Virgo side in action there was at school. Like, you know, when you used to pass like notes to each other between friends, mine was like blah 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 blah. P.S. You spelled Thursday wrong. So it's amazing I even have any friends from back in the day, but the moniker in me was there from an early age. But anyway, now each sign will have its own traits. So obviously, if you don't have Mercury and Virgo, the best starting point I would suggest is for you to look at your birth chart and look at what sign Mercury was in. And then I would Google something like Mercury in Aries natal chart or whatever the sign is. And that will help hopefully give you some descriptions that may help you identify those traits in the way that you communicate. And just to give one or two examples, like Mercury Leo, you might tend to be very dramatic and very passionate in your style of communication, whereas Mercury and Aquarius people tend to look at things in a very different way to conventional people, and maybe seen as quite radical or blunt in the way that they communicate with others. The other insight that you can get from your birth chart is also which house Mercury falls in. So, in my one, you can see that Mercury falls in my first house, which is also my rising sign. And this rules your personality. So, your first house is all about you and your personality. And for me, the literal meaning of that is that I'm all about communication. Now, if you've ever met me, the chances are that the things that you'll probably remember the most about me is the way that I talk, the amount that I talked, how fast I talk, um, to things that I've told people or the advice that I may have given them. I even work in communications and I'm literally here on YouTube communicating as I speak. So, for me, communication is literally what I'm all about. So, again, that can give you some clues depending on where it falls in your birth chart. And, to give another example, if Mercury falls in your fifth house, it's like you may be very expressive, and that's the way you communicate is a big part of how you get yourself out there, and your confidence kind of exudes from that. So again, they're just some other examples, and I would urge you to once again Google something along the lines of Mercury in your first house natal chart and see if that gives you some clues around what the description can tell you about yourself. Mercury retrogrades are an important event in astrology, and the explanation behind them requires a bit of science stuff. Don't worry, it's not too detailed. The most basic meaning that I've managed to uncover about the meaning of the Mercury retrograde is when the planet's orbit overlaps or passes by the orbit of Earth. So if you think of it like when you overtake a lorry on the motorway, and you sometimes can obviously feel the energy as you're starting to kind of pass the lorry, how it then changes when you're kind of going past the lorry, and then sometimes how it feels like after you've passed it as well. Now, this is the same effect when the orbits of Mercury and Earth overlap or pass by each other, and that creates the energy which will then impact us during the time that we know of as the Mercury retrograde. Now, Mercury effectively overtakes Earth around every 4 months or so, because of the speed that it travels around the sun. So that will tend to mean that there's usually 3 or 4 Mercury retrogrades a year, and certainly explains why my friends constantly complain whenever I say that there's one coming up, because they're like, another one. And it's like, yes, there's a few in the year. So it's something that we have to get used to. But I promise you that there is an important aspect to them, as well as the annoying things that can come as a result of them as well. So, one of the interesting facts about Mercury is that even though it barely has an atmosphere, it is one of the only inner planets other than Earth that has a magnetic field. Now, the magnetic field is actually probably a really good explanation of why the literal impact of how it affects us on Earth is effectively like scrambling signals. Now, things like GPS satellites have been known to be affected by its magnetic field, and some of the things that people experience is like feeling confused or having brain fog type symptoms during this time. Now, if you imagine the lorry example that I gave you and throw in like electronic signals for effect, you'll start to maybe understand like what Mercury retrograde is kind of doing. And if you're familiar with things like the Northern Lights, like this is where you can literally see the Earth's magnetic field at play. So, all the lights and stuff, that is our magnetic field. And you can see the energy particles dancing around like waves of color. So, imagine our magnetic field overtaking the magnetic field of Mercury. And maybe, yeah, you can start to visualize maybe what those fireworks of particles are doing out there in space that will effectively come down and impact us here. So, as I explained in the first section of this video, Mercury is a planet of like logic and rationality and communication, and effectively that all of that goes out the window during a Mercury retrograde. So, some of the things that you can expect to see or experience during this time include havoc with travel and transportation. So, consider this your warning if you're going on holiday or traveling, because everything from traffic jams or accidents or road closures, diversions, missed flights, cancelled flights, delayed flights, rail strikes, lost baggage, queues at security, missing hotel bookings. Like these are just some examples. So travel at your peril. And unfortunately, we can't all avoid traveling during a Mercury retrograde, but believe me, I have tried. Um, Similarly, there can be chaos with things like reservations or appointments. It's the classic time where you've forgotten about an appointment or you thought it was a certain time, turns out you were wrong. And again, this is all down to that signal scrambling. And another thing that it's like they forgot to tell you that it was cancelled, or you turned up for an appointment and they're like, they don't know that you've even made that booking in the first place. So systems and technology can be affected, and this is everything from phones dying, Wi-Fi issues, websites literally going down. It's also a bad time to probably buy electrical equipment or other devices, such as laptops, around this time, because you can probably expect some sort of issue with it. And Mercury retrograde is probably a better time to research the items that you're interested in and buy them when the retrograde is over, unless you like dealing with customer service departments for fun. Machinery is known to break down during Mercury retrograde. So, again, something I see all the time is like the fridge has gone down, like the washing machine's broken, the boiler's having issues, cars broken down. Like these all have moving parts. So they're the kind of things that can be impacted. And if for Friends fans out there, like this is probably the time where something really is wrong with the phalange, like if you're traveling and that's why your plane isn't going anywhere, for example. Now, communication, that's the other part of Mercury. And unfortunately, Mercury retrograde can cause miscommunication in every sense of the word. This is all types of communication, whether it's email, whether it's text, WhatsApp, DMs, social media, LinkedIn, face to face, video, phone calls, letters, files, documents, even things that you think about in terms of communication, such as how you interpret something someone said or the ideas that the communications might be bringing back around that time. So, as I mentioned before, memories of things that you're like, oh, yeah, I did think about that, but nothing really happened with it. So, these are the kind of things that can come up in a Mercury retrograde. And with the miscommunication, this is kind of how it's linked to, like, you might send a message to the wrong person by accident, or maybe you misread the time of appointments. That's where the confusion can come from, because you thought it was at 3 o'clock when it turns out it was at 2 o'clock or whatever it is. So you may take offense to something that you've said to somebody, someone said to you at that time, because you've misinterpreted it, or something that was just like an innocent comment or post on social media got taken the wrong way. Now, that could lead to arguments and bring up issues from the past that never really got resolved. So you may revisit conversations with people from the past. And since the retrogrades in general rule the past, this blast from the past vibes means that you might bump into people you haven't seen for a while. Things popping up on your news feed. So people may come up that you haven't seen on your news feed for a while. And speaking of people popping up, like the Mercury retrograde phenomenon of exes is there for a reason, and it's typically a time that you will hear from an ex again, or maybe you'll decide to give things another go. Now, I'll cover a bit more about that in the next section, but retrogrades are not ideal for starting new relationships or new things, but more of a time to rework things from the past or revisit things and have different approaches of how you move those things forward. So that's just a general thing around retrogrades, whichever planet is, not just Mercury. Now, you may reminisce about memories or come across old photos, which might stir up emotions. And, this blast from the past stuff could be very mental in the sense of like things that you're thinking about. And stuff that's popped into your head around this time is usually designed to inspire you to take some sort of action through inspiration or motivation. So, to summarize, it's basically a time to be careful and say what you mean what you say. But in reality, it's not so simple, because the point of retrogrades in astrology is not to like ruin our lives, even though it might feel like that at times, but to reset fated paths and destinies. Now, through the people we interact during this period, the universe is trying to get messages to you and is trying to encourage you to share messages in return. So sometimes being in the wrong place at the wrong time is often what Mercury retrograde is all about, because through the delays and the misunderstandings and the unplanned deviations, it's almost like putting you in the right place at the right time, but we just didn't see it that way because we were too worried about being late, or this isn't what we thought we were meant to be doing, or getting upset because someone said something that we've taken in a certain way. Now, it's usually forcing us to face things that we didn't know was an issue, or things that we may have been avoiding confronting. So there is always some deeper meaning. And whatever it's trying to achieve, it's no coincidence that Mercury retrogrades are either right before, during, or straight after other fated events such as eclipses and retrogrades in Mars or Venus, which means that they're here to usually shake things up, and that you're going to be forced to address some of these things very soon. So you can consider it a bit of a preview if you like, or the cleanup operation after the changes. We need to tie up some metaphorical loose ends. Now, Mercury retrogrades typically only last for about 3 weeks, and you will notice its effects at the beginning and at the end. Now, there's also what is known as a shadow period, which is roughly 3 weeks before and 3 weeks after. And the reason for that is because planets obviously don't have an on off switch. So as they start to move into a retrograde or come out of it, there's almost that warm up preview where the energies are blending. Um, so that's just something to remember, that technically it's a bit longer than 3 weeks, which isn't always great, but something we just have to deal with. Now, this final video in the Mercury series tells you how you might use it for predictive astrology and how it relates to the fated events such as eclipses that are happening in your life. Now, as I mentioned in the last section, Mercury retrograde will almost always fall around the time of eclipses or other key astrological events, and understanding which houses are being impacted by Mercury will give you important clues about how the two are working hand in hand to bring about the changes that are fated or destined to be. Now, I only look at Mercury during these periods because even though you can look at which houses are being impacted at any time of the year, most of us won't notice the day to day impact of Mercury just because it moves so quickly from sign to sign. Now, where Mercury is during the retrogrades is the bit I think is important, as the houses will most likely be the same as the ones that are being impacted by the eclipses. And therefore, the conversations, the ideas, and all the signal scrambling that I talked about are relevant because they are likely to be linked to the changes that the eclipses are bringing about. Now, remember, I told you Mercury is all about ideas and all about communication. So its role is to kickstart or get you to revisit things that you never got round to, or the timing wasn't right, but maybe it is now. Or maybe something you see or hear at this time will trigger something new that will force you to go, right, this isn't working. And then that's how the change comes about. So I'll give you loads of examples now. So bear with, right? So bumping into people from the past, like during the conversation, you might be inspired by something you say or something that you remember about them. So an old school friend, it's like, oh, I remember she was really whatever. And that is where the inspiration came from. So it wasn't just about bumping into that person, it's the kind of inspiration you took from that. Another example during Mercury retrograde, and this is the classic one, is what I call the rabbit holes on social media or online, where you're just innocently scrolling across your Facebook feed and you see a post, and then you click on this person, and then it's like, hang on, this person's commented, and let me look at their profile, and you just end up in this little rabbit hole. And as much as that's fun, and we probably do that most of the time, the purpose of this during a Mercury retrograde is by the time you've ended up on like this person's cousin's dog walkers, best friends, work colleagues, like neighbors profile, it's like, oh, they've shared this post about this course that actually you really might be interested in. Or no, it's something about taking you down a path to look for something or to show you something you didn't realize you were even looking for in the first place. So as well as losing things during Mercury retrograde, you might also find things. So perhaps a book that you never got round to reading, which maybe might be relevant at this point in time, or an old business plan that you may have written. Now, because Mercury retrograde is a classic time to revisit or reassess things, something that might now need reworking could be the perfect timing to get it off the ground. Now, finally, Mercury retrograde is also the key time for exes to come back as well. So, if you have any of the relationship houses that are being impacted by the eclipses, is this the time to give the relationship another go and have a conversation about where things went wrong and if you can make things work this time around? Now, linked to relationships, it can also trigger issues from the past. So, to give another example, if you didn't set boundaries and speak up for yourself in past relationships, Mercury retrograde might bring about a similar situation with your new partner. And this could be to urge you to maybe try doing things differently this time around. Or it could just be a reminder of why things didn't work out the first time. So maybe now it's like time to move forward. Now, this applies to other relationships as well, not just like your love interests. So, if you have eclipses in career or work related houses, Mercury retrograde might trigger situations related to your manager or some of your work colleagues, where again, you might be thinking, okay, this is the time to move on to a new role. Now, some of the words that have been flashing up on the screen as I've been giving you these descriptions are words that are related to any retrogrades, not just Mercury, but will be helpful in understanding what the universe is urging you to do at this moment in time. Now, if you didn't know your time of birth, you can still check your Mercury sign, as generally that hasn't changed. Like it won't change depending on the time you were born. So it should still be a really helpful starting point to know which houses might be being impacted. If you follow me on Instagram, I will tell you which houses are being impacted during the Mercury retrogrades, depending on which sign Mercury is currently in. So if you follow him in there, I'll tell you which descriptions to go and watch on my other video, which is related to the house descriptions. And between the eclipses and the Mercury, you should be able to kind of relate to the key themes that are going on in your life at the moment. And as I've said, they're usually the same. It's rare that you'll tend to have Mercury retrograde in different houses to the ones that the eclipses have been in. Now, whatever house it's stirring up, you should definitely never forget that the reason is always deeper and more fated than, just trying to ruin your travel plans. So there's no such thing as accidents during a Mercury retrograde. And now that you know what they're all about, you will naturally get better at noticing the kind of themes that are coming up during eclipse season. So with that, I hope you found this video series about Mercury interesting, and thanks for watching.